Hey, welcome to another great episode of Blind Ambition with Jack Kelly and Rick Chen. And I should have probably seemed so excited because today is a day where there's a lot of layoffs with Google. So I'll kind of, bring it down a notch. I don't want to be a jerk. And for this evening, because we don't stop working for you guys. We're always here. It's late at night. Well, not so much for Rick in San Fran, but here in New York. And we want to talk about what's going on. What's going on with Google, with Amazon, what's going to happen maybe in the future with Apple, Microsoft. So we got a lot to cover. I know this is super important because everybody's on edge. Do I have to worry about getting laid off? Am I next? Is there going to be another wave of layoffs? How do I make myself indispensable at work so I don't get laid off? Or if God forbid it happens, what do I do to get another job? So I figure we'll just talk about what's going on and hopefully give you some good advice how to navigate your career. And to start off, Rick, maybe you could share what happened today with Google.
Yeah, so Google's parent company, Alphabet, cut 12,000 jobs. So it's about, Alphabet is a large company. It's not just Google search, right? So there's Google Cloud Platforms that works with large companies to kind of set up their, cloud infrastructure. There's even things like Waymo, which is their self-driving car unit, right? So it's Alphabet, 12,000 people there, which is about 6%, a little bit more than 6% of their entire workforce worldwide was laid off today. And I think what is really interesting here is it's the same story that is being told by other companies and other executives in their layoffs, right? They're saying we expanded too quickly during the pandemic. Um, you know, the demand for, just internet related things or digital services is not the same as we had projected or as we had seen it before. And I apologize, or I take full responsibility for quote unquote overhiring. So it's a similar refrain.
It does seem like the same mantra, not only the amount of people that get laid off, but the same, mea culpa, sorry, we overhired, silly me, why did we do it? And but it's frustrating for the people who are let go because they want to say, wait, you folks were in charge. Why didn't you have some discipline? And the people in charge have seen the dot-com boom and bust, the financial crisis, the after effects of 9/11, the beginning of the pandemic. So you would think that they know how this is played and they would have been a little bit more foresighted to say like, hey, maybe we shouldn't hire that many. And why do you think they did it? There has to be a reason. Is it hoarding talent? Is it preventing people from leaving and doing a startup to compete? What do you think is why they let this go on for so long?
I mean, maybe it's because my day job is as a PR person,
Mhm.
and so I'm part making the Kool-Aid, but also drinking a little bit too. But I truly believe them, not necessarily at face value, but I do believe them in part that a lot of these executives right now, they do mean it when they say they take responsibility. Where they do realize they have overhired, right? And I think it's partly due to first, there's the talent hoarding. Um, you know, I want to find the best people. And if I can have them, if I can retain them, that is a brilliant engineer that's not going to start a startup that eventually is going to compete against me. Right. So part of it is a little like we could say maybe a cynicism on the part of the employer. Right. Alternatively, it means if I have, hundreds of engineers that are good, great, excellent, those are hundreds of engineers or hundreds of technologists or hundreds of marketers that are good, great, excellent that my competitors don't have, right? If I'm Google, I'm happy that I have this AI expert that doesn't start OpenAI and start ChatGPT, right? Or I have an engineer that is brilliant that doesn't work at Meta or doesn't work at Apple, doesn't work at Microsoft, right? And so there's certainly this like competitive streak because at the end of the day, these businesses, um, you know, I I don't want to like flat out say they're colluding, but they kind of are, right? Because
Because they're
you'll
all
see
doing the
this on
same thing.
Blind.
So it's not just one is doing it, they're all doing the
Right.
same thing.
It certainly seems that way from the outsider's perspective, right? Because it's almost like whiplash, right? It is Friday, the end of the week, and the first thing that happens this morning at 6 a.m. Eastern is Google announces its layoffs. And yesterday it was Wayfair and Capital One. The day
Yeah, I
before
didn't see
that,
that. Like, how many people were laid off, and what do you know the backstory for those two companies?
yes, I do. So Wayfair is, I believe Boston or just maybe it's a suburb of Boston, but the furniture online retailer laid off 1,750 people, 1,750 people yesterday. And then yesterday, Capital One, which is one of the cooler, newer, more young, hip banks, they laid off 1,100 people, and that 1,100 people at the bank were from the tech side. And so I say there's almost this kind of like follow the leader type thing going on, or at least that's my perspective. Because obviously last week you had Goldman Sachs, like the king of the kings almost, right? They announced their layoffs, and then this week, towards the end of the week, Capital One does theirs, right? I believe earlier this week there were other banks, other investment banks, that announced layoffs, and so there's this kind of maybe it's oh right now it's the season right where I can get away with laying these people off, or maybe they're kind of looking up to Goldman or these other large industry players and saying, well, if they're laying people off and they're my competitor, do they know something that I don't know? Right? Is something coming up, or is something going on that I should be prepared for? And should I be doing the same thing? And that's why I think some of these layoffs uh, that are happening right now, they have these huge headline numbers, of course, but that's partly a function that their reach and their size is just so large and they had huge headcounts to begin with. And I don't want to make a judgment if that's right or not, but the layoff count, when you look at it in terms of percentages, 5%, 6%, I mean, how much money are you really saving if you're Google? Like I always tease Google, like you have more money than God. You print money. Um, how much money is 6%? Like I don't know. Like Microsoft, you're doing video games with Xbox. You're doing Microsoft Office, which basically every computer business uses, right? Like you also have more money than God. Like how much money are you really saving by laying off 5%? That I'm skeptical.
You think that there's a movement, and no one is going to say this in public, that the C-suite of a lot of these firms, maybe they're growing weary of having the workers have the control in dictating the terms, where they're saying, hey, I want the free breakfast or free lunch. I want to get, large, base salary, bonuses, stock options. I don't want to work on Fridays. I want to be remote. And maybe they're using high inflation, possible recession, high interest rates as cover that, hey, we can now take back a little bit of the control and say, hey, let's say you have an, I don't, let's say you have an older manager who's, kind of baby boomer generation who is used to coming to an office with a suit on, being in the office. They could kind of bark orders at everybody. And now when they're at home, none of that happens. They're like their spouse partner saying, take out the garbage, walk the dog. And it's like, this isn't fun. I like to be in charge. So I wonder if it's a changing dynamic at play where now they're laying people off almost as a scare tactic in a part where they could say, hey, don't get too complacent because maybe there'll be another wave, or maybe we're going to move your job to another state, another location, in a different country. Or maybe we're going to tell you to go back into the office. And a person understandably be a little scared, like, hey, there's tens of thousands of people laid off. I'm not going to fight. I'm going to do what you tell me because I want to hold on to my job. So do you think this may be a little undercurrent of other things going on beneath the surface?
The revenge of the bosses.
Kind of, yeah. In a way.
I
Do you
hate to
see
say
that or feel
this.
that? Like, I'm blind. Do you kind of are you seeing like a resentment against the management class and like, where they're thinking, how dare you do this? And I don't know if the managers are on there and they're like, they keep like pushing us around and they're the bosses, like the workers are the bosses. This is not fair. Is that a thing?
It is indeed. So it's
Yeah.
something that I've seen on Blind, uh, perhaps in the last 1 or 2 months, right? So just right after kind of Thanksgiving and Elon Musk doing what he did over at Twitter. In the last 2 months, there have been different um, dozens of reports of, and this is across different companies, not just at Twitter, and certainly not just kind of the social media space, um, but you know, TikTok got rid of memberships. They got rid of reimbursements for home internet services. There have been other companies that are getting stingier with their daily, lunch stipends or free lunches. There are some companies that are certainly ramping up how many days you have to go back, right? We're seeing commuter benefits being cut at some of these, financial services companies or more like larger traditional companies that are outside of tech. And so we're suddenly seeing all of these, fringe benefits, we could say, that, in some ways were kind of unbelievable, right?
Mhm.
I don't think I've seen a company pay for your home internet service or your
I didn't know they did that.
right electricity bill or something, right? Like, granted, the free gym memberships that's probably been more commonplace, and we've seen that for decades even. But um, you're starting to see a lot of these cool benefits, this like swag, start to go away, and the answer that you receive from the companies are, well, yeah, of course it makes sense because we fear that a recession is happening and we need to save cash and we want to make sure that you're gainfully employed. But there's also kind of like a sense that like that little kind of social contract between the boss and the workers is being broken on
Yeah.
Blind.
And there are some real threats, aren't there? Think about it with Chat GPT or GTP chat, whatever order it is. It does look like it could be a competitor to Google, right? It seems that if from what I understand, Microsoft has a huge investment in, Chat GTP. And if you have you played with it all or
I have. One thing that's really interesting is I played around with it early on before kind of it got a bit of the buzz. And one thing that really annoyed me, and maybe it's my journalist hat
Mhm.
kicking in, but you would ask it a question and it didn't cite its sources. And so there was this sense of like, oh, well, this is kind of like a novelty,
Yeah.
but like maybe I only caught it because the questions that I asked it were things that I already knew or familiar with,
Right.
right? So I wanted to see kind of test how in depth or how accurate it might be, and there were some things that were like just close enough to be right, but there was still like a little bit wrong, and it didn't cite its sources, so I didn't know like what was the data because it's AI, right? What was the data that trained it? And then you more recently they started adding the sources. So they'll say like, "Oh, according to Yelp, um, one of the most popular dishes at this restaurant is XYZ," right? And I
Mhm.
was like, "Oh, well, that's a new thing." It's also cooler because it's a bit more in depth and kind of it kind of predicted that I wanted to know, you know, what other people thought was the best, right? And like that's the definition of best or most popular or whatever. Um, but I think it's still, I mean, it's obviously still a work in progress, but I wonder if there are accuracy issues for the topics that I'm less familiar with, right? That I just don't have that
Right.
domain knowledge to be able to understand that nuance or even understand what is correct and incorrect. So I think that's what scares me, right? Because I don't want to be misled, right? That's a lot of
Yeah.
power to have in one. I guess it's considered a nonprofit, but um, in one organization or one group, it's a scary thought.
It and the thing too, I wanna say Microsoft kind of funded for $10 billion or some crazy amount of money, so it probably get better and better as time goes on, but I think for years, there wasn't any threat to Google's domain within the search business, and if Microsoft uses this OpenAI and puts it into Bing, will it overtake Google? Probably not, but could it steal market share? Maybe. And the same thing you mentioned, TikTok. Meta is running scared because TikTok just ate their lunch. I mean, they just went after it. I got to tell you, I'm on TikTok. I'm addicted scrolling through it. I mean, it's so all of a sudden where I think a lot of these big tech companies thought, hey, we have these quasi monopolies and those last forever. And I wonder if part of this move, and I'm curious what you think, is that maybe they woke up and said, oh, wait, maybe we actually have to be a little worried and maybe we have to be a little careful. And maybe we can't keep lavishing money not only on employees, but just on everything, because there could be this disruptor that comes in and now we're going to be in trouble. We're going to be like the lazy big dinosaur that goes extinct.
So you're very wise to say that because in the kind of email that went out to employees, the CEO, Sundar Pichai, he does mention, oh, as an organization, as a company, um, we are going to take steps or continue the steps that we've taken already um, to be in what's called a quote unquote AI first company or have AI first
So
technology.
they feel the heat. They see them coming for them.
I think so. And I think, again, maybe it's just because of my PR background. Um, it's the lens that I'm using to kind of interpret is Google used to be known as the smartest people in tech, right? Like if you were anyone or anything cool, it probably came out of Google, right? So like the free lunch thing
Mhm.
in tech started from Google, right? They had an office out in the suburbs of San Francisco. You'd have to drive everywhere. It was really inefficient, right? You have like an hour and a half lunch because you have to drive over to the restaurant, wait for your food, right? Drive back. And so what they did was, oh, well, we're out in the suburbs, so we'll just build kitchens internally and we'll offer free food. So that way, our employees, they're incentivized to stay in the office and work.
I see. I didn't know that. And that makes more sense because, like, when you hear the free food, you think, well, wow, this is maybe excessive. I would like to have that too. But because if they're in the suburbs, that makes a lot of sense. Time you do that, and and the time you're going to eat your lunch there, it's going to take an hour and a half when you talk about driving to the place, eating, coming back, and then you come back, and you know how it is. You're not going to get right to work. You go to the men's room, you just walk around a little bit, you're a little like sleepy. So I could see how that happens. Interestingly enough, with Wall Street, they do a similar thing where they would cater in food as well because they didn't want the traders to be going out, because you want the traders locked to their Bloomberg machines and trading and watching the markets. So if you're leaving and something happens,
You're not making
you're
me
eating a
money.
hamburger and all of a sudden the market is going down, like, oh no, I got to get back to my seat. So in a way, they did it too. Similarly, not because they were so gracious and loved their employees and said, no, don't worry, we'll bring you, food, is they wanted them in their seat watching the screens so they don't miss anything.
I think that's exactly right. Right. I think maybe this is kind of a myth or a lore, but I believe there's like some piece of like high speed internet connection or like networking. And the whole reason we have that technology, and I can't think of it right now, is there's a hedge fund in Chicago. And back then, all of the trading was happening in like New York, New Jersey, right?
So
And
they
they were in
built this
Chicago. So
underground,
they built this
underwater,
underground
like,
thing, right?
super fast.
So
Yeah.
so that they could trade like
Yes.
half of 1 second
Yes.
faster or something like that, right?
So they get that little edge because they didn't get the edge because I'll get beat out. So you need it. That's how crazy. You had to be like so super fast. Yeah.
Right. So I forget if it was like something with like the actual like network or like the like being able to like build these like things underground or something like
I think it
that.
was a
But like
Michael Lewis book that he wrote, like Flash Kids, Flash, something's Flash, I think.
but like right, like there's like now we have that technology, or like now it's commonplace or whatever. But it was at one point like some guy just decided, like, how do I make my employees work more and work more efficiently, right? Like a lot of these like Disneyland style perks in tech, a lot of them, their origins were at Google, right? So
Hmm.
at Google, they have almost like a legendary HR team. They were kind of one of the first people, or one of the first companies to bring like analytics to HR. And so there are some things like in the early days, there were all these like weird news articles about, oh, Google asks these like brain teasers
Yeah,
during
I
the job
remember that.
interview. Why is a manhole round, and how many golf balls would it fit in this kind of truck? And they had this like analytics or a theory that um it's this lateral thinking that they're looking for, or like this creativity that they were looking for. And that's what made the like best employees. But then you started seeing like other companies and some startups, they started copying it, right? Or it was maybe because they had some Google employees that left those companies and started their own companies or worked at other places, and brought those practices. So we saw kind of that like cross pollination. But there's all these like things that I think we kind of take for granted, or we don't bat an eyelash at. And their roots were kind of a little nefarious if you think about it. Like if you think about like, oh, it's not like going back to kind of and I'm, maybe it's too simple of a point, but going back to that like bosses versus workers dynamic, like a lot of these things actually favor the boss, right? Like, oh yeah, like Jack, I'll give you $25 for you to order food. Um, but I'm gonna make dinner at 7 p.m. So all of a sudden,
Ah,
you probably would have gone home at 5, but I've suckered you into working 2 hours
that's
longer
brilliant.
to get your free $25 lunch, right?
That's brilliant.
Um, I mean that was part. I don't remember if you I don't know if you remember this, but that was part of the kind of controversy about Meta getting rid of the to-go boxes
taking their boxes home and bring it for their
for
family and friends. They're
dinners,
so angry, right? That
right? Like, oh no, my I figured out my employees figured out I hacked my system. They would just hang out until 7, get a to-go box, and go home immediately.
yeah.
What a horror.
Do you think, Rick, that as people, let's say whether Google or let's say other companies, the more you're there, you get to a point where you don't have that same drive, that same motivation. You're making a nice big fat salary. You have a lot of stock. You have a lot of options and equity. And do you then have a problem where there's this kind of lethargy of like people like they're not going to kind of kill themselves because they're not in the beginning of their career where they want to make something and want to do it, and they're really wealthy and they're really comfortable, and like, why am I going to kill myself? Now you're stuck with this group of people who are probably brilliant and nice and wonderful people, but they're so financially set that like, why am I going to kill myself? And does that become a problem? Is that a thing too that goes on behind the scenes that like we wouldn't be aware of?
I mean, I am going to be a little bit of a jerk and put Blind out on blast. But we're seeing it on Blind that there's a little bit of a freak out right now in the tech industry. Um, because Google and Microsoft were known as kind of retirement homes. Like it was kind of well known within the tech industry that if you wanted to like level up your career fast and that you're like really ambitious and didn't mind working the long hours, but you wanted to like learn and do a lot of things very quickly and advance very quickly, like startups were the place to go, right? You'll work the long hours, things are nebulous because it's like barely a company, right? They're still learning. You can kind of like spread your wings and level up really quickly. And you would kind of graduate to like more mature companies. And at the end of that kind of graduation scale was Microsoft and Google. And Microsoft and Google, they're big brand names. They have a lot of staff. They've been in business for like many years. They have all this infrastructure set up, right? So you're not creating processes from scratch. You're following someone else's playbook. And they were known as the place where you quote unquote rest and vest, right? You rest, don't have to necessarily work too hard, and you vest all your brilliant stock options, right? Or your brilliant uh restricted stock units for your stock-based compensation. And you get this great paycheck and you have the job security, 9 to 5. Um, take your shuttle there and take your shuttle back home. And the fact that this week Microsoft had the layoffs, Salesforce was at this kind of end too, in terms of kind of being like a retirement home. Salesforce, now Google, there's kind of a freak out and thinking, oh my gosh, there isn't that much of job security at all. Or, oh my goodness, like these companies aren't necessarily as safe and not necessarily the place where I might be able to just hang out and make TikTok videos about my day in the life, right? Or
Now, are they safe or not? Like, so those people, let's say that cohort of people who've been there, I'll make what, 10, 15 years, are financially set, and they're like in that, kind of just coasting period. Are they going to be safe because, I don't know, they become an institution within the company, everyone knows them, they've been there forever? Or maybe now is a game changer where they're not safe and they could be kind of severanced out or packaged out.
I mean, I think it was almost like a state of mind within the tech
Mhm.
industry, right? Because going to work at a Meta, a Salesforce, a LinkedIn, a Google, even if you were like an entry level engineer, 1, 2, 3 years, you had made it because you you worked at the company that had all of this kind of quote unquote job security, high pay, great work life balance, fabulous perks, like all this like infrastructure set up so you don't really have to like reinvent the wheel, right? So even at the like the earlier stages and the younger folks, they got to benefit from, quote unquote retiring in these retirement homes. And I think what is really scary right now for some folks on blind is, oh man, is this the great reset in terms of,
Mm,
expectations? Now bosses have the upper hand.
yeah.
What's next? Right? Like they're almost looking at the writing on the wall and saying, oh gosh, like is this the end of the age of these really high total compensation packages? Like, are we just doomed for lower TC in the future? That's certainly a common point of discussion on Blind right
Well,
now.
what do you think? Do you think it is, or do you think this is just kind of a bump in the road, and then eventually things will play out and go back, to the way it was?
So I think that our users are unfortunately a bit right. One thing that I've noticed just looking at posts on Blind from the people that have been affected by today's layoffs at Alphabet is there were more than usual, and it might just be more than usual than I expected. But some of these people that have reported getting laid off at Alphabet today, their reported TCs were like 500,000, 600,000, some close to $1 million a year. And when you're earning that much money at a tech company or any company, it comes with a lot of responsibility and it comes with a lot of experience, right? Like you're not going to be an entry level, whatever it is, earning 500K. Like, I don't care what industry you are, right? Even a doctor, they had to, be a resident making peanuts, right? Like, there's no way that um more junior folks are going to be earning these packages. And so they're senior, they're managers, maybe they're even directors that are being affected by these layoffs. And at that level, you're also probably high performing, right? You have a lot of influence. You probably have quite a few people that report directly to you. At that stage, you're responsible for probably leading divisions, functions, product lines, strategies, like from nuts, from soup to nuts. And so one thing that's really interesting, at least it certainly caught my eye, is wow, some of these compensation packages were quite high. But oh wow, this probably meant that a lot of high performers were laid off. A lot of senior folks were laid off. A lot of older folks were laid off.
Now, would they be able to be absorbed somewhere else? Or because if you have 10,000 from Meta, 10,000 from, Amazon and so forth, and there's so much competition, or is it not that much competition that because I've noticed with a lot, and I think we may have talked about it, when I would look at a lot of these open to work banners, I didn't see the very senior software engineers. I saw more junior people, salespeople, recruiters, HR, talent acquisition, no offense, PR, and recruiters. So recruiters too, and not so much the engineers. So can you tell as of yet, or the smoke hasn't cleared, whether there were a lot of other software developers and engineers, so it will be tough to get a job, or maybe not so much, so they can find something. Is there any clarity yet, or it's the fog of war still?
It's a little bit of the fog of war
Yeah,
because we're certainly in like uncertain times, and a lot of these things are just happening so quickly,
yeah.
and the job market is changing so fast. But one thing that I've noticed from posts and experiences mentioned on Blind, um, are people are finding jobs fairly quickly and within 90 days typically. So within three
That's really
months,
quick.
they're landing somewhere.
And
Right.
what are these, the software engineers, or these marketing people, or Any specific or everybody?
Everybody,
Really? That's great.
right? Because there are some companies out there that are like just licking their chops, right? And I don't mean to be crass about it, but there are some people that are thinking, oh my gosh, I would kill to have someone from Google, right? Because you're working at such huge scale. It's almost like having that brand name, like, oh, Google like cleared them. So these guys must be smart, or these guys must be like among the best, right? And the one thing that the caveat, I would say, the one caveat that I'm seeing is, well, it's easy for you to get another job, but if Google, Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, these high paying companies, these peer companies in terms of like talent that they're attracting and retaining are laying people off, um, who else is going to pay you these like fabulously high
That's the
TCs?
question, right? Will you pay that 500 or million? Will you have to go and take a cut? Or the person who's making the million, could they step into a senior executive role, like oversee a team, and then maybe the compensation is worth it? Maybe you're managing, I'm making this up because I don't know this as well as you do. So maybe you're managing 50 people and you have a budget and so forth. So then you come in not as an individual player, but watching over a whole team. Is that doable?
I mean, that could happen. And that's happened in the past, right? Where there's almost kind of this like on blind, they call it like down leveling or like a
Hmm.
discount in terms of, oh, well, a startup VP is like a director or like a senior manager at Google or Meta, right? And so, I mean, if you're the other way around on that equation, maybe you're a senior manager and you're like, oh, finally I could be an executive, right? Or like finally I can get this title that I've always wanted or would have taken me much longer, maybe, to get at one of these large companies. Uh, but the thing is, again, like even if you're getting that kind of like title or ego boost, maybe your pay isn't going to catch up. Maybe you have to go to a smaller company or a kind of less competitive industry, perhaps.
Is there
And
a bias, Rick? If let's say you're from Meta, from Apple, from Google, Microsoft, and you want to go to a second tier, third tier, uh, tech company, or even go into a different sector, ABC widget company, do those firms think, gosh, maybe it's too much firepower? Maybe this person's going to come in there and be a prima donna. Do you encounter that where, with good faith, you say, you know what, heck with big tech. I'm into education, whatever. Let me go ed tech and do something so different because I'm passionate about it. But then they feel, is he going to be like Mr. Big or Mrs. Big Shot because they're a Google? And do I have to, is that a thing or not?
I'm sure it is. I'm going to share an anecdote with you. I'm not going to reveal which startup that I used to work at that had this hiring strategy,
Mhm.
but and maybe it's not the case now, but there were one or two startups that I used to work at that would actively avoid hiring, even interviewing people that came from big companies or had huge company names like Google, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, what have you, on their resumes because there was this understanding that, oh, they're just going to reject my offer no matter what because I can't pay
Yeah.
$500,000. Um, or oh my gosh, my CEO doesn't even make that much money.
Right.
Almost
And then
like
they would
how
feel,
dare
because
you?
this makes sense because I would see this too, where they would feel that, well, they're not going to be happy. And then they're going to
Yes.
leave in a short while. So we're going to hire Rick, and then he's going to look around and think he's better than everyone else. And he's just going to go leave and go back to another, big tech company. And we just wasted all the time and energy. Or they say, like, what's wrong with this person? Why are they coming from this level, you know, I probably shouldn't do this when people listen to it and do my hands this level. Come to, they can't see me doing my level. So you can go from a certain level and come downwards. Like, why is Jack going down 3 rungs? That's a red flag, right? So like the
There's
job
also a
seeker might get kind of hit both ways.
there's also a third red flag. I don't
I
mean
know.
to dump on
Okay.
your parade,
Yes.
but some of the startups that I've spoken to, worked at, interviewed at even, um, they told me flat out, or I know that this is the general practice, that they do tell candidates flat out that they won't even bother interviewing because they think it's a waste of their time.
Yeah.
Even if you go through the entire process and we give you an offer, well, it's not going to be close to what you're expecting or what you may have been paid before. It's going to be a quote unquote downgrade. So I'm not even going to waste my time to give you an offer. And there's some recruiters, some of their objectives that they're kind of graded against for performance is um, how many of their outstanding offers are accepted, right? And so like you're almost like ruining their metric, or making their job harder because you're ruining their acceptance rate. It's almost like
Yeah.
it's kind of like the opposite of college admissions, right? Like Harvard wants everyone to apply to Harvard so they could say like, oh, only 1% of
Mhm.
people are accepted, right? Like we're so good, we're so great, we're so selective. It's like the opposite where I've interviewed at companies where the recruiter, you know, like during the verbal offer, they didn't even bother to write up the offer because they say, hey, like here's what we're thinking, are you even going to be interested?
Yeah.
And then there's been cases where I say, oh no, it won't work out for me, and I get marked in their ATS as like we rejected them, like we rejected Rick,
Oh
because I
man.
didn't, the recruiter would get his like figures messed up, his KPIs or his objectives messed up if he were have to one, do the work of writing up the offer, getting it approved by the finance committee or the HR committee or his boss or the hiring manager or whomever. And he gives me that offer and I say no, then he looks bad as a recruiter because he wasn't quote unquote able to close. Right. So there's like kind of this like third red flag
Yeah.
that most people don't think about.
Now, what about on the other side of the equation? Because I recall Mark Benioff, the CEO founder of Salesforce, kind of chastised the younger folks that they're not being productive enough. So this is the other side of the extreme we were talking about. Going from the very experienced people. So who's right, who's wrong, or is they both right, they both wrong? Like, is that a thing? Are the younger, you know, I think he just called them younger, right? I don't think they gave any age group or anything like that, just a big
Yeah,
generalization.
generic. Yeah.
Um, is it that, or is it the company itself, or is it the culture? They also laid off what, about 10% as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, that's right. Um, I, I, I think it is kind of a feeling on both sides, right? I think if a company has to fire someone, something happened during the selection period, the interview period, where they made a mistake, right? That someone wasn't a fit in terms of performance, maybe it's culture, maybe it was just timing. I don't know, what have you. Or, also if someone is fired, then clearly there was like a failing while they had their butt in the seat and they were working for that company. Something had to like lead to that point, right? Um, and so I can kind of see both sides, right? That like if you're the person getting laid off, you the company failed you. Like I'm just gonna be very candid, right? Because they weren't able to make the proper hiring decisions or business decisions or have the great enough strategy to be able to kind of survive and for to allow you to keep the job, right? And then on the flip side, maybe there's a failure on that side of like being able to identify the right companies, right? Maybe you like joined a Web3 startup or a crypto startup after the FTC FTX thing
Mhm.
happened, right? Like maybe that was like a bad decision, right? And so I think it's just a feeling all around, and I know it's tough to hear. Uh, I do think the company's to blame. I do think the executives, the managers, they're to blame if there's quote unquote poor performance on the behalf of like um the younger generation or like younger tenure, like more junior tenure, like new to the company, folks, because where was your mentorship? Where was your onboarding?
Well, could
Like,
it be if they're working remotely that there just really wasn't a connection? They didn't have a mentor, they didn't have a, supervisor who was there in the office together, and they were just left adrift. And then it's easy to blame and say, hey, you folks aren't working hard enough and you're not producing and so forth. But it's, you just left me alone. I really didn't get much guidance.
I think that's right. I mean, I'm revealing too much about my age and my old work
Yeah.
habits, but like in my early days, um, there was a lot of value of sitting in a desk late at night or late in the afternoon even. And there's that guy that on your team or in the company that everyone knows is a whiz at Excel or is a whiz at
Mhm.
this like way of doing things. Like only this person knows how to do it. And you learned how to do it or you learned that trick by having that proximity, right? Like being literally next to that person or being in the office where people told you, oh, you know, no one can get this done without Donna. Donna is the one person that like does everything, right? And you got to go and ask Donna, like, hey, how the hell do you do this? Right. And she told you, right? If you asked, or she would do it for you, right? And in a remote work environment, I think what maybe this is like my personal pet peeve coming out is with Google Meet and Zoom and all these like phone calls, they're so purposeful, right? Like there's no like serendipity, there's no spontaneity, right? Like I have to ask you like, "Hey Jack, are you free at 6:30 p.m.
Mhm.
to go on Zoom?" And you have to say yes. And I send you the calendar
Right.
invite with the link. And there's almost this pressure that once it's on my calendar, like, oh, like we've both there's almost this like formality to it, right? Where
Yeah.
we're in a meeting now. We confirmed our schedules and
Yeah.
we want to make the most of our time. Like I miss the days when before meetings people would just like goof off and talk about like, hey, what'd you do over the weekend or how are your kids, right? I've noticed that in some of these meetings that I'm in right now in this like hope post COVID, whatever you want to call it, this like online remote work generation, like we don't have that like BSing around before anymore. Like it just seems like everyone just like jumps right to it and like you lose that kind of culture. You lose those like relationships, those deeper relationships. You lose that kind of insider knowledge of, learning that skill of like how to write that macro or how to format the spreadsheet or the deck slide or something, right?
And I agree with you. I think that's why I believe we're going to probably see more and more, and we are seeing this, companies telling people to come back to the office. Now, it might not be 5 days a week, but it's, 3, 2, 4, maybe, because you do lose out on that. And like we talked at the top of the hour, where, what the leaders were saying about what's happening, I'm sorry, overhired, but also they also point out they're saying a lack of productivity and kind of a lack of that, I don't know what words to use, but that oomph, that motivation, that drive. And I think to what you're saying, to your point, that maybe happens when you're at home. It's hard to get that traction. You don't have those, as you said, those serendipitous meetings in the hallway. these impromptu conversations that lead to something bigger and better, that brainstorming session that you're not doing purposefully, you're just hanging out and just kicking ideas around. And maybe they're looking to say, hey, maybe we got to try that. Maybe that'll work better. And also it could be with the great resignation and the quiet quitting and the acting your wage, is that people just feel like left out. They feel isolated. If you feel isolated and disconnected and disengaged from your job, you're not going to probably work as hard because you don't feel it.
I mean, the one thing that I mean, you mentioned Mark Benioff and his statements. The one thing that I find an issue with is the way that he defined productivity. And I get it in his context. So basically, like to paraphrase, he said something about, oh, newer employees aren't as productive. And the example he cited was something like, oh, well, 50% of my sales team is responsible for like 90% of like all my revenue or something like that. Right. And, I've worked in sales early on. Like when I first heard that, I thought, huh, that seems like on its face, like really terrible, right? Like, oh, that means 50% make like 10 are responsible for 10% or less of the revenue or the work. And these guys are salespeople, so they should be, making in the money, right?
Mhm.
But sales is a relationship based
Yes.
business. And early on, sometimes all you're doing is just getting leads to pass on to another guy. And so, like, are you productive? Yeah, you're going out and sourcing these leads and passing them along, and eventually someone down the chain, someone higher, someone senior does close that deal and does book the revenue, right? Like I don't get credit for it, but I helped. I
Right.
contributed to that deal. Or if you're earlier in your career, you don't know as many people, or maybe you're a sales guy that switched industries and you have to learn a new product or a new service, and of course, it's going to be like a longer ramp up time. Or maybe you're younger and you just don't have like a book of contacts yet. You don't have your Rolodex. And it's unfair. Like part of me thinks like, well, maybe some of that is makes sense.
Could it also be, let's say, with Salesforce in particular, as a software as a service, a SaaS company, if you have less workers sitting in seats, whether at home or the office, they're not, you can have less customers. So it's almost, it's not really the fault, and I'm completely overgeneralizing, but it may not be the fault of anybody. It's just less people, less, less subscriptions. I mean, it's probably a very mathematical equation. So of course you're going to have less revenue because you have tens and tens of thousands of people now who aren't working, who aren't going to be using, their services.
No, you're exactly right. Earlier I mentioned that a lot of these executives, they're blaming overexpansion during the pandemic. Oh, we saw this crazy amount of
Mhm.
demand come up overnight. We expected it to continue, or oh, we needed to hire in response to meet that demand at that time. Um, and I think part of that is right because it's almost like this kind of I don't want to go as far as calling it like a self-fulfilling prophecy or anything of that sort, but there's certainly this like me tooism, right? Where all these companies they're hiring. So, oh, I have to hire more.
100% agree.
And I'm hiring, and then I need to make sure that all of these employees are set up with all of our tools. And so I have to like buy all these seats and I'll buy all this like extra software and these like accounts. And so you saw all these like Salesforce software as a service companies, they grew almost like organically, right? They didn't have to call these new people
Mhm.
up on the phone to get these sales. They just grew from existing accounts, right? And I think one thing that is scary is on the flip side, you have all these layoffs and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of, oh, these guys lay people off. I have to lay people off now too. And then when you're laying people off, there's fewer people, butts in the seats and fewer user accounts that you need, those seats on the enterprise software. And I think people are also thinking, oh gosh, Salesforce for many companies is like an integral part of what they do, right? It's almost like an accountant getting rid of QuickBooks. Like it's not going to happen, right? Like a writer getting rid of like their word processing, right? A banker getting rid of Excel. Like it just doesn't happen. So, uh, like if people are getting rid of like the big guy and I'm like a no name startup that's a business to business software service guy, like what luck is there for me?
Yeah, there's one last one we didn't bring up. Is Amazon different than the rest, or it's the similar fact pattern that we talked about?
I think one thing that's really interesting about Amazon is kind of two things, right? So, like, what they are most well known for is, their store, the retail, right? And they have, I believe, over 1 million employees, but about 75 to 80% of those employees are those like warehouse
Mhm.
pickers, the drivers, like the logistics side, the retail side. And so it made sense when Amazon did their first round of recent layoffs that when it affected the corporate staff, the first to go was retail, right? The people supporting retail or the people working in units that are sold in their retail. So Alexa was
Mhm.
affected, but also the guy that helps create the technology for the warehouses and the stores, right? Because they're all linked and so I think Amazon is kind of this unique situation where they almost got kind of like a double whammy, right? They got a whammy from the inflation concerns and people just not like consumers buying less because they had to save money or they could not afford to buy more or continue to spend as they did a year before or 2 years before. And then they're also one of the largest tech companies. And so they got hit by this kind of ongoing tech recession, right? It it just it's a bit harder for them, I think. And um I think it's very unique to Amazon as a business, right? We're also kind of seeing it recently with like Wayfair. Wayfair is kind of very similar in terms of it's online retail, it's e-commerce, but they were also a technology company in their own right. And those folks were affected too, right? So it's kind of getting hit on both ends, we can say.
Do you have any advice for the people, whether I'm blind or when we post it on, uh, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn, other social media platforms? Any advice for people who are listening to us or watching, either if they lost their jobs, what to do about finding one, or how to make them, how to make themselves employable and stay with their company and make themselves almost indispensable?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna sound a little preachy, but I
Mhm.
really mean it. I think when you're in that situation, it's very easy to kind of go down this like spiral of despair. And so I always start and say, no, you are worth it. You are a great professional. These companies hired you for a reason. And when they're hiring you, it's a business decision. They're thinking about it very hard. Oftentimes it's multiple people, and they all picked you. They all wanted you, right? So just know that and know that that's going to happen in the future. Another company, another team of people, the hiring committee, what have you, they're going to also want you. So that's a good feeling of being wanted. And it's also a validation of the skills, your experience, and also your personality and what you bring, right? That's all a complete package of you as a person. You can't separate that. So just know, like, yes, you are desired. You will find something. And the second thing that I almost invite people who are listening to do is to think broader, right? There was almost this kind of tiering that was very common on Blind of, oh, what's a tier one company? What's a tier two company? And they all tended to be in the same industry and the same types of companies. And I invite you to think more broad, right? You don't have to go from a quote unquote tier one tech company to go work at another tier one tech company, right? You could go work at you could be a star marketer at Goldman Sachs and go work in tech or go work in healthcare or go work at an airline, right? And you could be a star there. It's still like for like. You're gonna be great in one industry, and probably be great in another. It might take you a little time to ramp up, but you still have those like first principles and that foundation. And no one can take that away from you. And I think the third thing is there is a bit of a reset in terms of compensation. And so, if you did come from a company that has a reputation for paying very well, right? Let's say you're one of the people affected in today's Alphabet layoffs. Maybe in your first interview with the recruiter or the hiring manager, you want to lower your expectations for pay. And it might even help you for some companies, some smart startups out there, if you say explicitly, like, hey, like I used to work at Google. I know you guys probably think that I'm going to come in and ask for like $600,000 a year, but I'm not like that. I'm more interested in XYZ, what your product or what your service is. I really have done my research and I think that, oh, I actually want to work for you, the hiring manager, because you did this, this, this. Or, oh, I've heard great things about this company's, work culture and I want to add to that, or I want to benefit from that culture, or I want to learn here. Like, say all of those things up front so that people just don't think you're like a mercenary, a TC chaser, a TC optimizer, and that you're thinking about things more holistically so that they aren't scared or they don't think it's a waste of time to interview if you're just going to say no because the offer isn't as high as it could be.
I think that's great advice. That's really smart advice, particularly where people get caught up with the trappings of a name, with marquee name. Same thing with fashion. You ever see somebody? I remember there's a boss who would check someone's tie, turn it over to see like what the
Oh,
label was. Where people get so caught up in labels and fat and titles, and you're better off figuring out what do you really want to do? Because maybe you're a tech, and instead of tier one, tier two, tier three, to your point, maybe that's not what you want to do. Maybe you want to go to a bank. Maybe you want to go to hospitality, whatever. It's something that you're passionate about and interested in, and dispense, with all the labels and find what you're doing. And I've noticed I remember during the financial crisis, similar to what you were talking about, where there was a reset where people were making a certain amount of money. And let's say 2008, 2009, 2010, you know, the budgets really weren't there. A lot of people were downsized, a lot of layoffs, hiring freezes. So that it does make sense for someone to say, hey, you know, I love this company. I love what your mission is about, your products, your services. Um, uh, Obviously, because of the circumstances that go with a major reorganization, uh, and I know I probably earning more than what you're paying, but that's okay. I've put away money. I'm comfortable. My
right.
spouse works, and I'm looking for a great place to be where I can contribute. I could grow with the organization. I could give value. Maybe I could help mentor people, and that's really what I'm looking for. So this way, it takes away kind of how the HR or internal recruiter is going to be sus about like, what's up. So this way you're overcoming all those objections before they even think about it. So I think that's really sound advice, and I think that's what people need to hear about. So the media just likes being negative, because if you think about it, we didn't talk about this, Rick, but and again, you have these numbers better than I do, but the amount of people who are laid off pales in comparison to the number of people who have been hired
Right.
just since 2019. If you really look at it, I would guess, and I don't know the actual numbers. Maybe you do, that you have a better sense, but I would bet you we're still far and away more employment than non-employment. And I think because it's these tech companies and the Goldmans and the Morgan Stanleys, the high-end Wall Streeters and others, that's what makes the headlines. And and this is what's wrong with our society in part. It's like, they don't give the full story. They make it sound like, oh, because, Meta let go of X, Amazon let go of X, and so forth, that, oh, the world it's falling apart. Well, yes and no. For the people who lost a job, yeah, it's terrible. It's awful. But we both know that people are going to get up because they're smart and they're capable and they're going to find new roles. But they're making it out worse than it is, which creates more of a snowball effect because it freaks everybody out. But the real numbers, right? Like the hiring was amazing. So with all this laying off, it's still not bad. And unemployment is still like record lows. It's like what, about 3.5%. So things
Oh,
are still pretty decent.
can I one up you, Jack?
Absolutely.
Even with all of these tech layoffs, this tech recession,
Yeah.
if you want to call it that, San Francisco and Seattle, two of the biggest tech hubs in the country, in the world, still have unemployment rates below the national average,
Yeah.
even with all of these huge layoffs.
Yeah.
Um,
Because, they don't, when they're, think about it, next time you read an article about it, they won't give the caveat of what you said. They'll just say, big headlines,
10,000,
18,000,
60,000, yeah.
10,000, 12,000, and then, oh, we overhired, sorry. But they don't give it like, well, 2019, you had, X amount. And like, even with layoffs, there's way more people that were being hired in that time period. So like, they're still net ahead. And it's not great for the people who just recently gone, but it's not as if it goes back to 2000 level, 1999 levels, right? It's so, which gives us hope that it's not as bad as I think the media is trying to play it out and freak everybody out about it. It's bad for the people, especially for the people involved, but there's still jobs out there. There's still opportunities. I know you guys have a great job board with a lot of opportunities, and you're placing people, at your
Great.
shop. And I'm here. I read it just recently, a Wall Street Journal article that echoed what you were just saying, that people finding jobs pretty quickly. And I was so skeptical about that, but like, it's happening. I'm like, how is that possible? Because like, I know when I place people, it takes months. So I'm like, how is it going so quickly? Damn it. And then there's this, I would like to give a shout out to this person, but I can't recall the name of his company. It's a data analytics company. And they also kind of had data pointing that the turnaround from someone losing a job to finding was really fast. That a good chunk of people who were downsized got jobs relatively quickly. So yeah, there's a lot of green shoots out there of positivity, but that doesn't get really reported. That really, right? That's not out there as much. You have to dig to find that out.
Right. So Jack and I will report it. I mean,
Yeah.
just closer to home for a lot of our audience, Meta in 2019, I believe was about 40 or 45,000. They doubled in 2 years. So like by the end of 2021, it was something about like 80,000, 85,000.
Double.
And then all
Wow.
employees, right? So 40, 45 to like 80, 85, I think, doubled in 2 years. And their layoff, huge marquee number of 11,000. So you subtract 80,000 from 11,000, you're still higher than the 40,000 you were 2-3 years ago in 2019.
You know what? I'm going to ask for your help. I want to write a piece about that kind of stuff, because I haven't seen that anywhere where it breaks it down. I think it'll be a really good piece, right? To break it down with Meta and some others, where they were, where they are now. And I think it'll be a very illuminating, where people look at it and go, wait, that's not so bad. Yes, again, not to be repetitive, is bad for the people involved, and our hearts go out for them. And it's just a rough temporary, because people who are watching the show are smart, they're skilled, they're educated, they're hardcore, they're motivated. So I have no worries whatsoever that the people who are watching and listening to this they're going to find jobs. There's just no doubt in my mind, because that's,
right.
It's self-selecting. The people who are listening to this are career oriented, they're motivated. So it's going to happen. But for other people who aren't aware, yeah, I think that would be a really good piece to make people, to give a little sunshine, because those numbers are crazy. So 80,000 basically and so if you were putting on a graph, it's a blip. So again, I'm showing with my hands and like, this is, people are watching this, but like, just picture a graph where it's just going straight up and, then you have just a little blip down. So, all right, that makes sense. Nothing goes up to the moon, right? Nothing goes straight up forever. So it's kind of reasonable to have a little dip here.
I think it's like, to your point, Jack, right? It's just sometimes it's great to step back,
Yeah.
have that like perspective and realize like, oh gosh, it's not as bad. This too will pass, right? Or in the aggregate, oh, maybe this tech recession is a little bit of a nothing burger.
Go back to again, when you have those, if you look from, let's say, the financial crisis onward, and you see it looks horrible, like the big drops where, you see the line, but then before you know it, boop, 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 it goes right, it goes back up. And then over the long time horizon, it becomes a little blip because it evens itself out. And you look back and say, that didn't seem so bad. So I think we're going to look, hopefully, we're going to look past this 6 months from now, 9 months from now, and say, all right, yeah, that wasn't pleasant. It was a little scary. We were worried, but wow, look at us now. And that's what I'm hoping. I'm being very confident and optimistic that it'll take some time. I'm not going to be naive. It'll take some time to work this out and wring out the excesses. But I think long-term, we're going to be okay. And we're going to be moving forward.
I absolutely agree. And again, for those listening, I was nodding vehemently. Thanks so much, Jack.
Thank you, Rick. That was great, man. You gave a master class in what was going on. I think for anybody who both is in the tech sector or not in the tech sector, to get a really good grasp of what's happening, I think you were masterful in walking through what's going on with the companies, what's happening, and giving that insider look is amazing. Giving that insight, that people don't know about, pulling back the curtain, that's so cool. So I think this is fantastic. Thanks for staying late. I know you got a lot. You got so many things to do at work. So I'm glad you took time out, bro. Awesome.
I have the cheat code using Blind. Thanks so much, Jack.